Good evening and welcome back to The Black Body in the Public Eye. My name is Sinead Young and I'm the Danforth Endowed Professor of Psychology at Morehouse College. We started this conversation 3 weeks ago, and as of tonight, you would have heard from 9 Morehouse College faculty representing different disciplines and 11 roundtable guests, ranging from scholars, artists, activists, musicians, and politicians. What we try to do with this course is take you on a journey where instead of focusing on the lens of the observer, we try to focus on the role of the subject. It's the activists and the artists, both amongst and within us, who are often the visionaries that provide alternative versions of our realities and dream for us what liberation can look like, especially when we can't always see it for ourselves. It is with this belief in the not yet manifested, this vision, that people often become pioneers. Whether it's the first Black woman to run for vice president in the US in 1952, Charlotta Ross, or Ralph and June Campbell's 7-year-old son, William, who integrated the all-white Murphy Elementary School in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. There are so many leaders and visionaries that walk amongst us, whose names that we may never know, who have had a profound impact on where we are today and where we move forward to. While some of these names have been forgotten over time, some have intentionally been misconstrued or erased. The notion of being hyper-visible and simultaneously erased is the strange space where scholars like Moya Bailey, who we will hear from this evening, help to give us this language, notably the term misogynoir, to frame the unique constellation of sexism and racism visited upon by Black women in sports, politics, and in daily life. We are in a unique time and space that we can see change happening rapidly right before our eyes. There's been a reckoning, and there's a need for a reconciliation. But we need a reconciliation with truth. We need a truth in order to understand what it is that we're reconciling around. Injustice has to be met with restorative practices, as we've seen in other countries like Germany and Rwanda and South Africa. This has to occur in the US. Restorative practices begin by naming that truth. We have to name it, we have to identify it, we cannot deny it, we cannot make excuses for it, we cannot build statues to it. We have to have a shared understanding of what these truths are. So this evening, we begin the last part of our 3-part mini course with some of the stories that have been long forgotten and that have had such a profound impact of where we are today and where we are going in the future. As mentioned, this course is being sponsored by the Morehouse College Public Health Science Institute and the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership, in collaboration with our colleagues from Coffee Bluff Pictures. And I would like to thank our colleagues at Coffee Bluff, including the writer and director, Ms. Deborah Riley Draper, who I will turn it over to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young. What an honor to have been a part of this amazing 3-part mini course with you and the esteemed faculty of Morehouse College. I attended a PWI, not an HBCU, but my family is rooted in HBCUs. I was 3 years old when I went to my first homecoming with my mother. She was a proud Savannah State graduate, along with her 3 sisters and 1 brother. And if you fast forward a few decades, I was at one of the last homecomings that my mother attended before she passed away. My mom, Jeanette Coleman Riley, she was there because she would be recognized as the Golden Emeritus alum, which made me very proud as I looked on from the stands. And she stood out there with our neighbor and her college classmate, Dr. Clifford Hardwick, who is the grandfather of actor Amari Hardwick. So it was a really great moment for me. So it makes me super proud to be able to bring my book and my film to Morehouse College and contribute to the HBCU legacy because it's contributed so much to me. It's impacted me in great ways. So as we think about legacy and impact, I think it's critically important that we recognize these 18 athletes. They defied Hitler, they defied Jim Crow, and they won hearts and medals at the 1936 Olympics. Their names and their stories are worth hearing. Tidie Pickett, Louise Stokes, Jesse Owens, Dave Albritton, James Clark, John Brooks, Willis Johnson, Jack Wilson, Art Oliver, Howell King, Cornelius Johnson, Dr. James Luval, U.S. Representative Ralph Metcalfe, Fritz Pollard Jr., Mac Robinson, John Terry, Archie Williams, and John Woodruff. Much love and appreciation for allowing me to be a part of your team for the last few months and weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing their stories. I think if you have not yet viewed the documentary or read the book, I highly recommend it. There are stories in there that have to be told again and again and again. I just want to go over once again what the goal of the course is. And essentially, it is some of our learning objectives to describe the socio-historical basis of institutional racism as represented in sports and the intersection of theories of scientific racism as they relate to Black bodies through public policy, advertising, and media. To analyze the role of race science in sports and modern policing, and also use the intersectionality framework of race and gender to examine how women in sports are viewed or have been viewed. As always, we highly recommend that if you have questions, please use the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer all of your questions. If you are inclined and would like to engage with us on social media, we ask that you use the hashtag #MorehouseBlackBodies and Olympic Pride American Prejudice. And then if you have any general questions, you can always email info@coffeebluffpictures.com. So just as we've done before, we have another exciting lineup of faculty for you. Morehouse College faculty, we have Dr. Corey Claiborne, who's an associate professor of English. We have Professor Ron Thomas, who is the director of our journalism and sports program. And we also have Dr. David Wall-Rice, who's a professor of psychology and the principal of the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab. We will, after our faculty presentations and Q&A with the faculty, we will move into a very exciting roundtable discussion that will be moderated by Deborah Riley Draper, where we have former Mayor of Atlanta, William Campbell. We also have Asia Evans, who's an Olympic bobsledder that we'll hear from. We'll have former NFL player Takeo Spikes and scholar, critical race feminist and disability scholar, Dr. Moya Bailey. So you are in for a treat. I am going to turn it over to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. I love this picture, Dr. Young. This is a picture of Louise Stokes and her little sister. Louise Stokes was in the 1932 Olympics and the 1936 Olympics as a young Black woman. And behind her stood the community of Malden, Massachusetts. She did not have all of the money to go to the 1936 Olympics, but the Black men and women in her town. Not only did they sew enough clothes for Louise to have for almost a month's worth of parties and events in Berlin. She had more clothes than anyone on the ship, but they also ensured that she had spending money, and the mayor of her city took care of the fees, $500 to make sure she could go. The idea of community and athlete and us bonding together to elevate and lift our Black women, our Black people, is not new, but it's something we need to borrow a little bit from the past and see how they did it. It's a great blueprint for the future and a great blueprint for all of us. So to talk a little bit more about family, legacy, and community and how all of this works together to create elite athletes, we have Dr. Corey Claiborne, Associate Professor of English, with Black on Purpose, a narrative about sports, integration, and the beloved community. And this is a very personal presentation for Dr. Claiborne.
Community is so important. And like my title says, Black on Purpose, narrative about sports integration in the beloved community. But my talk is also about what you see when you look at this picture. It's about what sustains us. When I look at this picture, I see my father, Claudius Barrett Claiborne, born January 11th, 1947 in Danville, Virginia. He's in the center holding the basketball, right? And he's with the rest of his freshman basketball team. And the person kneeling in the middle, a man a lot of people don't know, but who would change the history of the integration of sports. His name is Hank Allen, and we're gonna talk about him as we go along because he's so important to this idea of community. And one thing I also want to say as I begin talking about these narratives about Blacks integrating sports, and my father in particular, is the fact that Black people loved Black people. And I think this bears repeating. So in the small town of Danville, Virginia, situated about 40 miles north of the North Carolina border, the people who became the heroes are the people that were in the immediate community. Because I think that too often when people look at the Black image, they think about what Elizabeth Alexander calls the collective Black trauma that binds Black people together. And in that trauma, for example, Muhammad Ali talks about being born the same year as Emmett Till, right? And watching a 14-year-old boy mutilated and his body lying in a casket. And that really shapes who Muhammad Ali becomes. But the community that surrounds him and that surrounded my father also shored them up in the face of those communities. So what you do and what you have is something like a counter narrative. And the counter narrative would be the images here. So Camilla Williams was born in Danville. She was the first African-American to have a contract with a major opera company. And she was on the mantle of my father's home. I mean, they weren't related, but that is who his family held up as an example. The same with Wendell Scott, also somebody from Danville, who my father could look out of his window and see working on cars. And he became an image of what was strong in the Black community. And my father later on, who would integrate the tennis courts and go on to integrate intercollegiate sports at Duke University and in the ACC in general, becomes part of that narrative. It's what the writer Casey Lehman calls that Black abundance, this idea of this great narrative that goes counter to this narrative of trauma. And so even in a world that took images of Black people and made them a threat, this counter narrative never died. It said that Black people are beautiful. It whispered Black boy joy and Black girl magic and Black lives matter, because that was what was at the center of keeping communities strong. Because whenever we have discussions about Blackness and the Black body, it takes us back to what life was like in Black enclaves. I mean, these exclusive Black middle-class communities, and Danville was very much one of those. It had strong Black businesses, a Black bank. In the play, Having Our Say, the Delaney sisters, who lived to be 100, talk about how having grandparents in this community really shaped who they are. So there are simultaneous narratives, right, that we always need to remember. So in this other narrative that the Black community has, my father, and he's pictured here, he's kind of two over from the woman in the checkered dress, right? They had schools because the public school didn't necessarily educate them in the way that they needed to. And so they would make sure that they took time and effort and money out of their own pockets to make sure kids were educated. That was ultimately Black love. And what you see also is this narrative, and Langston Hughes says this in so many different ways, that Black people are beautiful. So many times what you see is these images that are also reclamations. And this is what Deborah Draper talks about, those 18 athletes who are left on the room floor by Hitler. When she brings those images back in her project, and looking at the Olympics, I felt that same kind of pride. And so looking at my father's image, he's the one all the way on the right with the big ears, you can always recognize him. And standing behind him is Hank Allen. And all of these Black men, you get this picture and you understand that this community worked together and they work together in love. So one of the things that I think is always important is that we see in the writings of Toni Morrison, this idea of Black love in Black communities. And that's what infuses her writing. And she admonishes us always to love ourselves hard. And I think it's not by accident that if you go to the lynching memorial in Montgomery, her words are on the wall of that memorial. And she's very clear to understand that in the outside world, they might not love your image, except if it is a traumatic one. She says they do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. But what we do, I think often through our words, again, this counter narrative is provide that love. So while I always point out that there was love and there was Blackness and there was counter narrative, this does not mean that, Black people were not in struggle and aware that these narratives, that traumatic narratives and negative narratives exist. So in the EJI, the Lynching Memorial, there is a slab that's dedicated to the victims of lynching that were in Danville. Also, 2 blocks from my house was the capital of the Confederacy that turned into the public library, that denied my father a library card, but you have this kind of monument that stands there that's very clear. Also, what a lot of people don't know about Danville, this is a picture of a public marker at the bottom, is that Bloody Monday was one of the most violent clashes with police during the 1960s. I mean, so much so that Martin Luther King made a visit to Danville in order to speak about the violence that they saw there. So 1963 in civil rights is a very important time. In 63, in April, you have Martin Luther King writing a letter from the Birmingham jail. Bloody Monday in Danville is June 10th of that year. Medgar Evers is assassinated June 12th of that year. The March on Washington is August 28th. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church where the 4 little girls are killed is in September, and then John F. Kennedy is assassinated in November. And so by the time that King comes to Danville, he understands that at this place, he had to do something to address the trauma. And here's a short clip that talks about
Danville,
that.
Virginia has long been one of Virginia's primary industrial centers. Danville is proud of its quiet residential areas, which surround the business and industrial heart of the city. The many old homes are a reminder of the city's colorful past, when it served briefly as capital of the Confederacy.
As long as the Negro is not free in Danville, Virginia, the Negro is not free anywhere in the United States of America.
We will defy the injustice. I have been arrested in the city of Danville some 5 times. I've been to jail before. I'm willing to go to jail again.
June 10th stands out above all the other moments of marching and demonstrating, because that's when my wife was beaten severely by the chief of police. And the sad thing about that is that it took Danville many years to admit that they actually beat the demonstrators as we were fighting for our human rights.
This church right here was the focus. We had all our mass meetings here. Everybody would put in a dime, quarter, 50 cents, and that helped us with our movement. We would come here at this church and conduct workshops to show us how to demonstrate, what to do if we were confronted. Andrew Young taught some of the workshops. He would tell us that when you march, if you get spit at or rocks thrown at you, you're not to retaliate. We were nonviolent. We were supposed to just go limp and let them arrest us.
I've seen some brutal things on the part of policemen all across the South in our struggle. but very seldom if ever have I heard of a police force being as brutal and vicious as the police force here in Danville, Virginia.
So one of the things I think is really key too is a lot of the images even that you see of police brutality, of water hoses and dogs, and police coming out with billy clubs is actually Danville, even though it's attributed to Alabama. And integration, and this is a particularly important with my father's story, it comes late to Virginia. So they're not made to desegregate the schools until a federal mandate in 1965. Hank Allen, who was the basketball and the baseball coach that I talked about for my father, he goes on to work at UVA, and actually that becomes his job, you know, going around and desegregating schools. And he would go on to consult with the T.C. Williams, whose integration of the football team is the subject of the film, Remember the Titans. But I want to come back and talk about why basketball in particular is important for image, and my father's story in particular. And one of the things is, like Yusef Komunyakaa says in this poem, is its beauty and really the kind of dangerousness that these players represented to people at that time. So Barry Jacobs, who has this great book about integrating the SEC and the ACC, talks about my father being between two worlds. And ultimately, it is like what Du Bois talks about, like having this double consciousness, understanding the way that the white world sees you, but also be very clear of the way the Black world sees you itself. But it's interesting when they tell the story of my father integrating sports at Duke and in the ACC, they usually start with, oh, well, he was the first player here, so this means something, right? This is a screenshot from a game, and he was a Black History fact for that month because it was the 100th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's birth, and they were saying, oh, well, you know, there's another person who integrates. But that's not the full story, because the full story has to go back to what he learned about community, what he learned about activism, what he learned about pride in Blackness. And as Langston Hughes says, the 1960s, this, you know, things were blowing up, the riots were coming. And this is really important. So what's left out of the story is a story also about the community that my father formed at Duke. And this is actually my mother in the center in the white. And they took over the Allen Building in 1967 and 1969. And part of their demands were, you know, to end to police brutality, and they wanted equality in global justice. And my father participated in those demonstrations, even though he was an athlete. I think that's him with the glasses, leaning. And it's also very clear that all of them were studying, right? And this was because they understood that double consciousness. They understood what people would say about them being in this space. So they were very clear, even in protest, that they were going to be doing some work. My friend Richard Benson at Spelman has a great book about radicalism and activism and student movements in the 1960s and 70s. It's called Fighting for Our Place in the Sun. But one of the things that's really interesting, and you can find this in the archives of Duke, was really not only how my father was feeling, but how the community of Black people were feeling at Duke at the time. So she writes a letter that she left in the typewriter of the Allen Administration building to my grandmother, and this is what she says on February 13th, 1969. This is to inform you that presently I'm sitting in the basement of the Allen Building, at present the Malcolm X Liberation School. I'm doing fine, do not worry. Incidentally, if you have not heard, we've taken over the building. And then she goes on, you know, there's no violence, but if there is, CB will protect me. And she talks about all the things they're doing, but she signs off, your liberation-loving daughter, right? Very clear that their community was about liberation. And here's some of the artifacts that you can see in the Duke University archives. This is really, they give a scenario for revolt. Here's the same picture from the Malcolm X Liberation School, but they've turned it into a community platform where people can talk about what kind of justice they need in the current day, right? And so this is my dad talking about the importance of community, and I think I'm almost out of time, but I want to show this really quick and then I will end, because I think this is really important.
The basketball story has been told before. Barry Jacobs has a wonderful book about the integration of the ACC and SEC, where he talked to all the Black players and put together all of their stories and its social significance and their social significance. But, Barry Jacobs' book is called, or the chapter about me is called Between the Worlds. And I really was between the worlds. My background is very similar to the backgrounds that you have heard. I was a National Achievement Scholar. I was one of 2 presidential scholars from Virginia in 1965. So I had a chance to go practically anywhere I wanted to based on academics, but I also played basketball. And my high school coach, Hank Allen, who I always credit when I'm talking, said, you have an opportunity to do something that's significant. And he, in fact, drove me down to Duke for the interview. And he would come to basketball games and he would always say, "You need a little money?" And he would give me something, So I came from a very strong community. Hank Allen was the vanguard of that community. But I was also a part of the Black community here at Duke. So when I'm asked, why did you go into Allen Building? It was because my community was here among the Black students. And I went into Allen Building with my community. There was never, I wasn't worried about losing a basketball scholarship or not playing basketball anymore. I mean, the season was almost over. I played the next game because I just practiced that day. I was in Allen Building. So I didn't play I think it was the West Virginia game.
Okay, so finally, this is the exhibit about my father in the Danville Museum that used to have been the Confederate Capitol and then the segregated library where he was denied a card. And so I want to leave us with some questions. So what will the story be about my father? Will it simply be the integrated Duke Story basketball program, or will it be that he was someone who was fiercely loved by his community, who ultimately he made proud? I think we are the ones who are going to decide what narrative is ultimately told. Thank you. And he's on the chat, so if you have some questions, you can ask him. And I left some sources down below. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Claiborne. That was excellent. And welcome to both Professor Claibornes. It's really, really good history to learn and to share. So we really appreciate that. I'm going to share a photograph with you all now, and I'm going to hand it over to Deborah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, both Dr. Claiborne and Dr. Young. Community and family are critically important. And before I talk about this photo, I do want to talk about my community, because one of the first people that I met when I was not at an HBCU was Tawana Monroe, and she's my dear friend, and she's on this particular chat. So I wanted to thank her for all that she's poured into me, from her beloved across the way FAMU while I was at FSU, and we formed a community that's lasted forever. And also Janice Yates made a comment. She was at FSU as well, and she said she wished she had taken that HBCU experience. So, but we laugh about our experiences, but lived experiences are really important to learn and to understand. And if we look at this photo, this is a lived experience of our 1936 Olympians, and it represents both beauty and danger. This is the 1936 Olympic Village. And you see Mac Robinson with his hat just so. You see John Brooks, who was at University of Chicago. You see Ralph Metcalf, and you see Cornelius Johnson. And they're walking, and they have great strides, and they look amazing. And if you look just behind them a few feet, are Nazi police officers. I don't think they used the term racial profiling in 1936. I'm not sure why those officers were walking so closely behind them. But what we know when we look at this picture is definitely double consciousness. It's definitely both beautiful and dangerous. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Thomas to talk about the rebirth of the Black activist athlete, because like those athletes, whenever you step out of your house onto the field, no matter what, your Black body carries with it resistance, protest, and activism.
Good evening. In my presentation, I will spotlight Black activist athletes over the last 200 years. I contend that sometimes the athlete's mere presence was activism because it caused white society to respond and often lash out. Other Black athletes earned the term activist by blatantly defying societal norms, what author Howard Bryant calls the heritage. I'll read narratives about many of these athletes, and the photos you'll see were arranged by our journalism program's project coordinator, Devin Emery. Sometimes the Black body takes you to freedom. Tom Molyneux was born enslaved in 1784 on a plantation in the Washington, D.C. area. He used his bare knuckles to defeat a fellow captive in 1809 to win a huge wager for the plantation owner. Molyneux's reward was his freedom plus some cash. He took a ship to London, won several bouts there, and on December 18, 1810, battled British champion Tom Cribb in the ring. Thus, Molyneux became the first American to compete for a world championship. Molyneux should have been declared the winner in the 28th round, when Cribb was knocked down and could not return to the middle of the ring in the required 30 seconds. But Cribb's aide claimed Molyneux had illegal weights in his hands, which gave Cribb time to recover and eventually win the match. Molyneux also lost a rematch and died in 1818, but at least he died a free man. Sometimes the Black body is assaulted on the playing field, so it must invent ways to protect itself. That's what second baseman Frank Grant, a great minor league baseball player in the 1880s, did by pushing wooden slats up his pants to shield his legs from white opponents who tried to spike him while sliding into second base. Thus he invented baseball's first shin guards. Grant led my hometown Buffalo Bisons in batting from 1886 to 1888. But in 1887, teams in organized baseball had been banned from signing Black players to new contracts. So in 1889, Grant joined the Cuban Giants in the Negro Leagues and played there until 1903. He was inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame in 2006. Sometimes the Black body is so versatile that it dominates more than one sport. That's what Orr Washington achieved. She was undefeated for 12 straight years in the All-Black American Tennis Association in the 1920s and 30s, winning 23 singles, doubles, and mixed doubles titles. Simultaneously, Washington dominated women's basketball from 1930 to 1943. She made the Philadelphia Tribune Newsgirls a powerhouse as their captain and leading scorer for 11 consecutive years. And she was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame posthumously in 2009. Sometimes the Black body exhibits courage in the shadows. 2 months after Brooklyn's Jackie Robinson famously integrated Major League Baseball's National League in 1947, Cleveland Indians owner Bill Veeck acquired Larry Doby from the Negro League's Newark Eagles on July 4th, while Doby was batting a league-leading .458. The next day, Doby played his first game in the American League. The movie 42 and numerous books chronicled Robinson's many stresses. Doby had different struggles to endure. Jackie and I talked often, Doby once said. Maybe we kept each other from giving up. When Robinson debuted, the public already knew him as a three-sport star at UCLA and Brooklyn's minor league sensation. Doby had no such reputation, and the team owner believed that publicizing his signing would put pressure on him. So Veeck didn't tell Cleveland's players that they would have a Black teammate until the day before Doby walked into their clubhouse on July 5th. 2 players refused to shake his hand. The next day, one of them, Eddie Robinson, refused to lend Doby his glove. That season, Doby got only 5 hits in 29 games, batted a horrible .156, and struggled as an infielder. But in 1948, he moved to center field, helped Cleveland win the World Series, and was on his way to a stellar career. There's an iconic photo of him and white teammate Steve Gromek celebrating a World Series victory. That was a feeling from within, Doby said, at his Hall of Fame induction in 1994. The human side of 2 people, one Black and one white. That made up for everything I went through. I would always relate back to that whenever I was insulted or rejected from hotels. Sometimes the Black body overcomes physical challenges that would overwhelm most people. but not Wilma Rudolph. She was born in 1940 and survived double pneumonia, scarlet fever, and polio, which mainly damaged her left leg. At age 6, she could hop on one leg. At 12, she could walk without a brace or orthopedic shoe. At 20, she became the first woman to win 3 gold medals in the same Olympics, taking first in the 100, 200, and 400-meter relay in the 1960 Olympics. Wilma said, "My doctors told me I would never walk again. My mother told me I would. I believe my mother." Wilma's hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, offered to hold a parade in her honor. She refused to participate unless it was integrated, so Clarksville held its first desegregated public event. Sometimes the Black body refuses to cross the line to step into the field of combat. That's what Muhammad Ali did on April 28, 1967, when he refused induction into the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. Sometimes the Black body feels compelled to step up to the podium, which Tommie Smith and John Carlos did with fists raised during the 1968 Olympics to draw attention to racism and poverty in America. Sometimes the Black body refuses to move, literally. On October 7, 1969, the St. Louis Cardinals traded Curt Flood, a superb outfielder and near 300 hitter, to Philadelphia, or so the teams thought. Flood, who was a friend of mine, refused to move to his new team in a city known for its racist fans. After 12 years with the Cardinals, Flood refused to be treated like a piece of property. Flood declared, "A well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave." In court, he challenged baseball's reserve clause that tied a player to his team until the team released him or he died. Flood lost in the Supreme Court, but scared owners opened the door to free agency. However, age and stress-induced alcoholism stole Flood's talent, and baseball denied him both post-playing jobs. Personally, Flood recovered, but he acknowledged that, "I am pleased that God made my skin black, but I wish he had made it thicker." Sometimes Black bodies act as one, which occurred in 1965 when Black players boycotted the American League All-Star Game because of the racism they encountered in New Orleans. Black players couldn't get a cab, couldn't enter some nightclubs, and at one restaurant, when a Black player hung up his coat, a white patron trailed behind him, took down the coat, and threw it on the floor. Many Black players flew home in disgust, and the game was moved to Houston, where it was played 2 days later. Black players in general stifled their voices in 1970s to early 2000s, feeling they had to protect their jobs, their growing salaries, and commercial endorsements. They also felt pressure to remain silent by team owners and by the predominantly white media. To me, that began to change when the Miami Heat stood as one, wearing hoodies in sympathy with the slain Trayvon Martin in 2012. Sometimes the Black body can't stand the pain. The killings didn't stop, as Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, and Walter Scott were all slain by police or under police custody within only 2 years. 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick couldn't stand for it anymore, so he sat through national anthems at 2 preseason games to protest police brutality. On the advice of a former Army Green Beret, Kaepernick decided to take a knee before the game on September 1st, 2016. He did it quietly, respectfully, just like the soldier who knelt before Miles Lewis to give him a folded American flag at the burial of his father, Congressman John Lewis. Sometimes the Black body has to walk away. That's what WNBA superstar Amaya Moore, an Atlanta area native, did when she skipped the last 2 seasons to help prisoner Jonathan Irons challenge a 50-year sentence for burglary and assault. On July 1st, Irons left the Missouri prison a free man after a judge overturned his conviction. Since the recent slayings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks, the Black body voiced protest everywhere. Those bodies challenged white football coaches' insensitivity at Florida State, Oklahoma State, Mississippi State, and Iowa. Black NHL players formed the Hockey Diverse Alliance, and 4 WNBA players will pursue social justice instead of a league title this year. And finally, sometimes one Black body expresses the concerns of all Black people as we traverse a world filled with gunfire, health disparities, and environmental hazards that shorten our lives. Speaking before the NAACP's march on the Georgia State Capitol in June, Atlanta Hawks coach Lloyd Pierce said, "I want to finish by saying, I was born a Black man, and I know one day I'll die a Black man, but I don't want to die because I'm a Black man." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. That was so powerful and learned quite a bit. So we really appreciate that. And again, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah.
The image of the Black man is always powerful. It's especially powerful when we can tell our own story and we can own our own narrative. But that's not the case in this illustration. This illustration happened 1935 on the run up to the Olympics. It was about the Black athletes. And as we know, cartoons and illustrations always have a very powerful way of giving us social commentary and telling us what the masses, the dominant narrative, are thinking. So as you look at this image, all of the Germans are in this Space Needle-like building, and they're looking out with frowns on their faces at these 4 Black bodies who are supposed to be Ralph Metcalfe, Euless Peacock, Jesse Owens, and Ben Johnson. And what that says in German is, will the view be that Black?
And I'm professor of psychology and principal investigator of the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab at Morehouse College. It is my pleasure to be with you today and to talk about the Black body in the public eye. And I want to thank my esteemed colleague and the Danforth Endowed Chair of Psychology here at Morehouse, Professor Sinead Young, for pulling this together, along with filmmaker and writer Deborah Riley Draper, for the great work of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice that prompts our discussions here today and over the past few weeks. Thank you. In thinking on the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin and the courage to stand against the juggernaut of white supremacy that existed in Germany at the time, my mind raced and set on the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat. I thought of his sketches of the Negro athlete that he centered in many of his pieces, and then on the specific representations of Joe Louis, and then his 1984 Big Snow, where Jesse Owens' name is tagged just under a brown face, as is Berlin 1936, and the Olympic rings off to the left. Like many, I knew of Owens, but not of the other 17 Black Olympians who traveled to Germany to put in work against national racism abroad, while also representing for a United States that demonstrated as just as racist toward the Black bodies whose physicality literally built the nation and who were now sent abroad to build a reputation for the country in sport. Deborah Riley Draper helps us by providing glimpses into the selves of the full set of the 18 Black American heroes with rich time on the SS Manhattan, the ship that takes the thoughtful, anxious, and practicing bunch from New York City to Berlin. An interesting note is that the New York Shipbuilding Corporation that built the Manhattan was based in Camden, New Jersey, which was home to boxer Jersey Joe Walcott, whose name is also on Basquiat's Big Snow piece. On board the SS Manhattan, there is a point at which Ralph Metcalfe, who in later years represented as a Chicago congressman, looks to put a bit of a battery in the back of his fellow sportsmen and women, explaining ultimately that, quote, all we should do is focus on our event, to think about our race or our jump, our match, represent yourselves and your school and country. That call for representation hit. It shows as the same type of representation that the neo-expressionist Basquiat started us with. And this representation is his extension of the Black athletic aesthetic, or rather the Black aesthetic, I haven't gotten to the athletic part, the Black aesthetic that originated from the Black arts movement. An aesthetic that explicitly looks to the Black power of the Black nationalist movement and to the representation as resistance that was telltale there. Architects of this aesthetic, of this expressionist movement, are the likes of Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka and Larry Neal, who says of the Black power that drives the work that a main tenet is the necessity for Black people to define the world in their own terms. Amir Baraka, co-editor with Larry Neal on the seminal anthology Black Fire, further explains of the Black aesthetic that,
and we use blackness to represent the ultimate goodness and the ultimate reality and the ultimate truth. So that to say that's black, or try to be black, brother, is to raise yourself above, the filth of easy accommodation in the white world.
that ultimate goodness and the expression of and striving for a self that is good and truthful is bound in self-storytelling. This is identity work, self-psychology. And because of the universal context of racism that persists for Black folk, it is fundamentally representation as resistance. Our 18 of the Berlin 1936 Olympics tell us this with their stories, and they are bound to folks like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. But before we go into Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and the significance of their representationally resistant selves, let's do a bit of a self-primer. The self can be understood as individual, relational, and collective. And these expressions of the self are adaptations to and affirmations relative to context. They are interculturally and intraculturally defined. Think Du Bois's double consciousness that portends a Black cultural and American cultural reality to be negotiated by Black folk. So then, the individual self is you and how you differentiate your self-concept from others. And the relational self is how you match to others, where your self-constructs are shared and personalized bonds of attachment are fomented. Examples are family, friends, or teammates, perhaps. And then the collective self is based on symbolic, perhaps impersonal bonds. It can be an idealized self that is seen in popular others or in representative members of the body politic. These selves are intersecting and overlapping, it's important to understand, meaning that you might find pieces of them across a variety of behaviors, but there are places where we see clearly their representation more heavily in some areas than in others. So to Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, through their self-stories, as we know them, they illustrate distinctiveness of the individual selves that we describe. In their brotherhood, for the time that they were closely connected, there is evident the sharing of self-concepts indicative of the relational self. And the religiosity that was a touchstone for both men through Islam shows examples of collective selves. We find relational selves explicit in the Jim Brown called Cleveland Summit, where athletes from across sports supported Muhammad Ali and his refusal to go to Vietnam. And in highlighting Edwin Moses and his scientific approach to winning relays in his movie The Five Bloods, Spike Lee offers us a connect to a possible collective self, one that Moses represents as archetypal excellence, an excellence that is representational resistance by default because of presumed stereotypes that are affixed to him as a Black man. And of course, if you went to Morehouse College, there is a relational self too, because of how Moses and Spike Lee represent for a shared college self. You see that I have on my Fly Like Moses sweatshirt. So this type of flavor or cultural continuity that Lee and Moses offer allows for us to pivot squarely to a definition of the modern Black athletic aesthetic that Nelson George puts forward by examples of Marcus Hayes and Daryl Dawkins, and I suggest implicitly through the example of innovative sports commentator and analyst Stuart Scott. Nelson explains about the Black athletic aesthetic that not only did Black men change how the game was played, they changed how it was described. To further this point of description, I want to invoke the words of poet Saul Williams and the body articulation of Misty Copeland. They are so connected to the fundamentals of the traditional Black aesthetic, to the contemporary Black athletic aesthetic, and to the demands by both for Black people to define the world in their own terms.
The systemic structure built to keep me in place is the stage I dance on. Black and woman. Motherships, my mother's hips beheld deep space. Astronaut of corporal grace. Born in a landmine. As an idea points its toe to flex, to shape the form of possibility. I am testament, twirled into afterthought, the touch and taste of epiphany. To match my strength is to feel your own. Yet like any born to blaze a trail, to sing a song and land in jail, to risk it all, to change a game, to shift the form and take its name, to follow stars when chased by dogs and pas de chat, to shatter norms, to solo and to feel alone, to take up space in history's home, to harbor hopes, wishes, and dreams, to bring the untold into being. The oppressor's gaze ain't all I seeing. I'm unlike any.
So this beautiful performance of identity and unadulterated presentation of self is a through line of Black athletic aesthetic that we see today in the representation as resistance of contemporary athletes across sport. This would include Makur Maker and the assumption of his agency and cultural capital in taking his basketball skills to Howard University to quote unquote change the culture. Mahmoud Abdul Rauf played for the NBA and principally refused to stand for the singing of the national anthem in 1996 and was consequently suspended by the NBA as a result. Colin Kaepernick, who likewise refused to stand for the singing of the national anthem in protest of racial violence against Black and brown people in 2016, has not played in the National Football League since January of 2017. And the WNBA as a league has been coordinated in support of social justice for Black people since before it became in vogue. Pictured here is the Atlanta Dream. Kenny Stills was arrested in his protest for justice for Breonna Taylor, who was shot to death while she lay sleeping in her bed by Louisville, Kentucky police. And this takes us full circle to the Olympic Games, this time to 1968, where the systemic structure that's set to keep them in place was the platform that medalists Tommie Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman protested from. For Smith and Carlos, with Black Power fists hoisted. The fists demonstrating a signal of Black power and an expression of the representation as resistance that the 18 Black Olympians from the 1936 Berlin Games started us with. And this is a mapping of my thinking today, showing the interconnectedness of constructs and expressions of self that serve as a Black athletic aesthetic, a practiced technology that I dare say gets us all closer to freedom. I thank you again for the opportunity to share with you all here. I look forward to the broader discussion and invite you to continued conversation with the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab on Instagram at DWR Lab. Take care.
Powerful. Thank you, Dr. Rice, for that presentation. Really, really powerful. I am going to open it up for questions now. And if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. And we have some Morehouse students who are joining us. First up, we have Olamide Fagbamie, who is a sociology major and a current Morehouse student. Welcome, and you can unmute yourself and ask your first question.
Hello, everyone. As you said, I am Olamide Fagbamie. I'm a junior sociology major from Douglasville, Georgia, by way of Nigeria. My first question is generally the idea of transferring what we know from back then until now. How should we go about these ideas of representation and continue to push forward that narrative of, denying oneself of what they may need to do, such as the athletes, and propelling that needs to get their brothers and sisters that are incarcerated.
Do you want to direct that to anyone in particular, or is it just open to anyone to answer?
It's open to anyone, but I will say because of the presentation that was done by, if I'm not mistaken, it was Professor Ron Thomas, that he can answer that as well. But it's definitely open to the whole floor.
Okay, thank you, Olamide.
I think sometimes it just depends on what comes across your life and how you respond to it. In the case of Maya Moore, she met Jonathan Irons through her family, I think when she was 16 years old. So she's had a longstanding connection with him. And just the idea that such a young person, I forgot how old he was when he was convicted, but it was less than 20, and to be given a 50-year sentence for something she felt he did not commit. I think as time went on, she became more and more convinced of his innocence and the fact that he really needed somebody of influence to help him out of his situation. And I think also there's obviously a depth to her. And after 9 years, and we have to remember with women professional basketball players, they don't have an off season. They play in the WNBA and make really very little money for professional athletes. And then they go to Europe, and that's where they make their real money. And she had done that for, I think, about 9 years. And that's tremendous wear and tear on your body. You know, that's probably 12, 13 years of an NBA season. And so I think the combination of maybe physically being somewhat worn down and mentally feeling the urgency to help Jonathan Irons convinced her to take the 2 years off to help him out of his situation. I think it'll be interesting now to look in the future, see the future, and to see whether she returns to basketball or becomes totally immersed in social justice issues. And it'll be interesting to see or does both. So it'll be interesting to see what she does in the future.
Thank you, Professor.
Can I say something? So one of the things I think is interesting, you were asking about representation. And I think that it's also so important to look at these athletes as, you know, everyday human beings as well. I think that's one of the things that Olympic Pride, American Prejudice presented to us, especially because of the fact that we only knew about one of the 18, right? They were everyday people who were really doing things in ways that represented themselves and their communities in the best possible light. And then I think about, you know, what's still weighing heavy on me is the passing of John Lewis. And one of the things that John Lewis talked about was that you didn't have to be a superstar, or you didn't have to be, you know, a juggernaut, as it were, to make a change. You know, the idea is to see where it is that you find injustice and represent and act accordingly. So I think that one of the things that we see in these athletes who are standing in the gap for people who are marginalized and who are compromised or disenfranchised is you see people who very much are an extension of a community that has been that. And you see them representing and being themselves. And I think there is a courage that's associated with that we oftentimes skate over. You know, being yourself is very difficult. We know this as people of color who oftentimes are pushed into the margins, but so many other people don't recognize that. So I think that to amplify and to look at and to deconstruct exactly what these athletes are doing on a world stage is important, in a way to be able to look at how it is that we can map it to what goes on in our everyday.
Absolutely. Professor Claiborne, I'm not sure if you wanted to also respond.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to connect a couple of things I heard, and thanks for pulling this together. And I've learned so much listening to everyone else. But, you know, one of the things that makes us human, to go back to where we started, is our self-awareness. And I think even as athletes, we have a self-awareness beyond our performative roles. So in each case, you know, if we give up that humanity, if we give up who we are just for our performative roles, it has dire consequences. You know, if I look at all the athletes that integrated sports back in the 60s, the same time I came along, a lot of them are not with us now. I mean, those were not easy burdens to bear. But some of us chose to try to hold on to our humanity despite all the challenges we were being forced to encounter for the first time. So yeah, self-awareness is really key. And, you know, the psychological part, you know, with connecting our own individuality with our public self, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And those were really the crux that was driving this course. So absolutely. Professor Claiborne, part 2, I don't know if you want to add something as well.
No, I think he kind of said what I wanted to say. And you know, we're on the front lines, but I think that for people who've been in this long struggle, of rights. I think that I like to sit in the room and listen, because I think it forms, it helps me form, you know, how I move in the world.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Young, there's some great questions in the Q&A. So while we have a few minutes, let's do that in our student questions.
Turn it over to our next Morehouse student. One of the questions from Turner Cooper was, how do you see Black LGBTQIA+ identity and activism intersecting in athletics? And I think that's a really important question. And I'll open that up to any of the panelists.
I'll take a swing at it. Get it swing because I'm wearing Jackie Robinson. So I think that I tried to, and I think a lot of that is probably an extension of what I said a little bit earlier in terms of representation and the courage that's associated with being yourself and presenting yourself unapologetically. And so I think that, you know, we take a lot of lessons when we're talking about, you know, Black Lives Matter. Even we understand the architects of that were queer women who were standing in their full selves and articulating who they were in terms of their Blackness, in terms of how it is that they represented and presented themselves. So I think, again, we take lessons from the courage of being oneself and respond accordingly.
Absolutely. And I there's a couple of other questions I think that will actually be really good in the roundtable section. One of the questions that Cynthia Durant has asked is, our Black youth need to hear this information. Do you all as scholars feel that we should come together as a community and establish schools separate from the normal forms of education where the narratives have been warped to keep them back, Black youth, from their history? And I will say that Morehouse is in a number of high schools and junior high schools in the community. We're doing a lot of outreach, and this is really the history of HBCUs to do work outside of their walls. So it is absolutely happening. I'm going to turn it over to Travis Dobson, psychology major graduate, class of 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Young. First, I want to just really appreciate all of y'all for putting this together. I really appreciate Dr. Young, appreciate everyone that's had their hands in this. And I viewed it over the past couple of weeks and really have gotten a lot from it. My brother, Lami, he gave a really good synopsis of what I felt as though was a really good question. But what I wanted to ask Dr. Claiborne and Dr. Rice were sort of some things along the responsibility of athletes as well as people in youth today. So Dr. Claiborne, sort of around the, what type of responsibilities do you feel is that we have? Because understand that y'all bear such a weight and y'all put so much of the groundwork down. What responsibility do you feel as though we have to move forward? And for Dr. Rice, I sort of want to ask, sort of understanding the historical context that they put so much groundwork forward, and that the context is just completely different today because we are such at an advantage that we've moved forward, but also understand the dichotomy of it, that there's an illusion that we've moved forward as well, that there's not much that really has pressed forward, just disguised in a different way. How do we go about doing that? So that's what I want to ask both of you all.
Well, thanks for that question, Travis. You know, I would go back to what Corey actually presented, is that we are a part of a community and we have an obligation to that community. And the minute we start to see ourselves as individuals devoid from that community, then we both lose. You know, as an individual, I lose and the community loses. And, you know, some of us that are older, we're fortunate enough to have grown up in this beloved community. It is not true for young people today, you know, where so many kids go to integrated schools. But I think there still is an obligation to your community, whatever that is. And, you know, Morehouse is great because Morehouse teaches community. That's an essential element. But for everybody else, I think connecting back to your roots, if you will, but also to who you are connected to is an important part of this.
Thank you for that.
And I just want to say, to add on, I think you're in a great place questioning right? So I started, even for myself, right? Like I have amazing parents, but I started asking questions. So what does activism look like for me? What's possible for me? What are ways that you can address problems? And I think that you can go back, you know, to slavery. Black people have been addressing inequality in different ways. And they kind of give us a blueprint if we really start to ask ourselves and ask them and ask our ancestors, and I think listen to the answers. So as soon as you get into a community of people asking those questions, I think a lot of things are possible. So
And
that's a big question.
Thank you, Dr. Claiborne.
Yeah, I think the same thing. I think to educate oneself in a way that allows them to understand a truth and to understand a context, like Mr. Dobson, you were saying that the more things seem to have changed, they haven't. The context of white supremacy remains consistent. And I think calling a thing and responding responsibly to that is profoundly important. I do think, I remember last week there was a question that was asked about if athletes have a responsibility, and I think they do. I think to whom much is given, much is expected. If you have a platform, you have a platform to do something, and you have a responsibility. Now, what you're speaking out on is on you and the community you come from, but you absolutely, I think, have a responsibility to make the world better because of the space that you occupy. That is a privileged one.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you to the students for asking such great questions. Thank you to Professor Thomas, to Dr. Rice, to Dr. Claiborne, to Dr. Claiborne again. We really appreciate all of you. Really wonderful. We are going to now switch gears and prepare for our roundtable discussion. And in preparation for that, I wanted to show this photograph of a 7-year-old William Campbell on opening day at his school in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. And he was the first Black to integrate that school system. And so we have the privilege of hearing from him today. So we have a fantastic lineup for you all. This roundtable discussion is going to be moderated by Deborah Riley Draper, again, the writer and director of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, Versailles 73, American Runway Revolution, Illegal Rose, and a number of other exciting projects that she's working on. Joining her on the roundtable will be the Mayor William Bill Campbell, who was Mayor of Atlanta from 1994 to 2002. He became the 57th Mayor of Atlanta and the city's 3rd African-American mayor. Under his leadership, the city leveraged the Olympic legacy into tangible benefits for the people of Atlanta. He forged innovative partnerships with the private and public sectors to empower communities with new tools and hope for the future. His proactive community policing programs resulted in double-digit decreases in every category of crime. Mayor Campbell has a vast legacy in the city of Atlanta, including in the areas of housing, commitment to providing equal opportunity for minorities and women, increased participation by minority and women-led firms at all levels, and bridging the digital divide between the rich and poor, ensuring that all of Atlanta's children have the skills to compete in the new millennium. Since retiring from the city of Atlanta, Bill Campbell has continued his love of public service at churches, political functions, motivational workshops, and leadership forums. We will also be joined, and a student just tweeted at me, the Moya Bailey, who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University, and is most recently a visiting professor at MIT. Bailey is a scholar of critical race, feminist, disability studies, and she's co-authored a book entitled #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice. It was just released this year via MIT Press, so go and get that. She currently curates the Transform DH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities. And she is also the digital alchemist for the Octavia Butler Legacy Network. And I talked in my introduction about those visionaries and those people who can see far beyond our current reality. And Octavia Butler was certainly one of those people. We're also pleased to be joined by Takeo Spikes, who's an NFL Hall of Fame nominee, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He's the photographer and author of the book Behind the Mask, a collection of intimate short stories about the photographs of great NFL linebackers. Takeo is now executive producer and co-host of the Behind the Mask podcast, which tells the unfiltered stories of top athletes. As an Auburn University alum and University of Miami MBA graduate, Takeo uses his platform to promote the importance of education. He's also joined the ranks of the Players Coalition to help end social injustice and racial inequity. Couple of stats. During his 15-year NFL career, Takeo was a 2-time All-Pro and a 2-time Pro Bowl selection. He played for teams including the Cincinnati Bengals, Buffalo Bills, and San Francisco 49ers. Takeo was also named a team captain in 13 of his 15 NFL seasons, a true testament to his leadership and work ethic. He retired from the NFL in 2013 and is a native of Saundersville, Georgia. And we are also so pleased to be joined by Miss Asia Evans, who is a 2-time Olympian Women's Sports Foundation, 2-time Olympian. She's also a Women's Sports Foundation ambassador of the Women's Sports Foundation. The Chicago native is on a mission to inspire and empower young women to reach for their dreams while also showcasing beauty, strength, and athleticism. Asia was a first-star track and field athlete at the University of Illinois, where she also earned 5-time All-American and 3-time Big Ten championship titles. Not long after her collegiate success, her coach encouraged her to train for the bobsled. In her Olympic debut, Evans earned a bronze medal at the 2014 Olympic Games in Sochi, Russia. Evans also participated in the 2018 Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang. Ms. Evans was also a spokesperson for anti-discrimination and body confidence campaigns. And since the 2018 Winter Games, she has transitioned from a sports lineup to creating Asia Wins, a brand focused on helping others win in all aspects of life. Her foundation, Aspiring Journeys Ahead Asia Foundation, was put in place to inspire the next generation of female student athletes, leaders, and trailblazers by providing young women with resources to maximize their collegiate experience. Today, Evans continues to work with organizations such as the Women's Sports Foundation and PSK Collective to inspire and empower women. So we have like such an amazing lineup for our last night. So I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Deborah Riley Draper.
This is so exciting. Mrs. Spikes, how are you doing?
I'm okay, Dr. Young. I've been called many things now, but not the Takeo. But it's pronounced Takeo.
My sincerest apologies. I'm going to blame it on my British accent.
No, you know what? It's okay. You was just trying to make sure I was paying attention. That's all.
Yes. Oh, and Mayor Campbell, we're going to ask you to come on video as well. The first question, actually, I'm going to pick one from the Q&A box. Alethea Jones asked the question, and this is for all of you to chime in on. She asked it of me, but I want to hear what you guys think. When you hear the phrase beautiful and dangerous as it relates to the Black body, how does that make you feel? She finds that this is an intriguing part of our Black girl and Black boy magic. Asia, let's start with you. Beautiful and dangerous, that phrase. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think for me, the phrase beautiful and dangerous just shows this power behind it. For me, I think of athletes like Serena Williams that had such a strong presence both on and off the field, as well as that beauty and presence about her. And I think that her resilience, the way she really came through and made sure to trail the blaze for others after her, just made her that dangerous powerhouse. And so that's what that dynamic gives me.
And then I'm going to get Dr. Bailey's perspective on this too. Mr. Spikes, go ahead.
Beautiful and dangerous. It means several things to me. I think the big thing is trying to figure out, well, not trying to figure out, but who is it coming from? But usually when I hear that term, I think it's the best of both worlds. And that was something that we used to use. It was a term that we used in the locker room in the NFL. It was something that was praised just because we wanted to be excellent on both sides of it. Whether or not if you're walking into a meeting, your appearance, your attention, the attention to detail, and then what makes you dangerous is being able to understand that attention to detail when you walk into a meeting or a first time meeting. And now when it's time for you to show up on the football field or show up anywhere, you know that you're prepared. So now that makes you dangerous with your knowledge.
Dr. Bailey, when you watch Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, the first line that you hear from the 1936 Olympics is that Negro is dangerous. So when you think about the use of dangerous by that British sportscaster in 1936 and the idea of beauty and dangerous today, how does that relate from an esteem perspective, a psychological perspective, and a cultural norm perspective?
Oh, I appreciate that framing. One of the things that I was thinking about was who is saying beautiful and dangerous, because I think it feels very different when it's a conversation amongst Black athletes than it is when it's coming from perhaps a white fan or spectator. And one of the ways I see beautiful and dangerous weaponized against us as Black people is this idea that we become animalistic if we are both beautiful and dangerous. We aren't people. So I think there's definitely a difference for what happens in our own spaces, how we use that, how we see ourselves as both beautiful and dangerous and able to obtain and do the things that we need to do, both on the field and off. But I do think that there's something that happens when white viewers take on that idea of us as beautiful and dangerous that doesn't actually allow for our humanity. And this sort of relates to, one of the questions asked before around LGBTQ identity. And I think about my own work on Caster Semenya, South African runner, who has been called dangerous and monstrous, made a man by so many people because of her body and how people understand and read her as a threat to the sport of, women's running. And so for me, beautiful and dangerous has that, dual language depending on who it is who's using that term.
Again, this idea of dual meaning, double consciousness. Mayor Campbell, at 7 years old, we saw this picture of you. It was quite beautiful with the little socks and the little shoes, little 7-year-old boy headed into, and a beautiful little 7-year-old boy headed into a dangerous situation because you were integrating for the first time schools in North Carolina. Help us understand what your family, that decision to put you in that position looked like for your mom and dad as they thought about how they were going to represent and how they were going to reconcile both being family and being community leaders and using their 7-year-old as part of the resistance.
Thank you for having me, and to Dr. Young, it's a distinguished panel and delighted to be a part of this discussion. In 1960, my father, who was president of the NAACP in North Carolina, had decided that in order for integration to go forward, we had to sacrifice children. And he applied for me and my older brother and sister, and then there were about 7 or 8 other children that made applications. The school system turned all of them down except for my application because I was the youngest, thinking that a 7-year-old, it would be somewhat easier for the transition. So for 5 years, I was the only Black child to integrate the schools in North Carolina. Incredibly difficult, and as I've mentioned earlier when we were discussing this, Deborah, I don't know that I would have the same courage, the moral courage to sacrifice my son or my daughter to those kind of uncertain and violent times. It was incredibly difficult. I was beaten and spat upon, and it was just a very difficult time. But what I want everyone to appreciate is that we were leading civil rights demonstrations every single night. My father was leading them from Shaw University. Interestingly enough, I heard Dr. Rice talk about John Lewis. Well, my initial connection with John Lewis came in 1960. He came with a number of other young activists to Raleigh, North Carolina, to Shaw University, a small Black college. In fact, there are 2 Black colleges in Raleigh, North Carolina, Shaw University and St. Augustine's College. And I heard someone earlier, I think maybe Dr. Claiborne, saying she had not actually been privileged to attend an HBCU. Well, I was born on an HBCU campus. There was a Black hospital at St. Augustine's College where I was born. So we would lead these demonstrations every night. And I will tell you, they all thought it was something special to have little kids out in front. And so we would lead these marches up and down the streets of North Carolina, Raleigh, and it was traumatic because the Klan was very active in North Carolina. They would be protesting on the other side in full Klan regalia. It was a traumatic time. We were in front of the movie theaters, the restaurants. We jumped into the pool and everyone got out. It's interesting, I just saw a news clip, it's a famous news clip of someone who jumped into a pool and they threw acid into the pool. That was on NBC yesterday. So all that simply to say that it was a terrible time, but necessary, and sacrifices had to be made. I was privileged to bring remarks at John Lewis's funeral, and it was really a lot of our personal relationship, but the intersections between when John Lewis came to Raleigh in 1960, and my father met him there at Shaw University. In 1963, my father came back from the March on Washington and began raving about this incredible speaker, John Lewis, the young John Lewis, who really, he said it electrified the crowd. I think when you look at what's the totality of what Deborah has done with her film and about sports and protests and what it means for Black lives and Black Lives Matter, all of these things have really sort of come together in sports in many ways. I think of 2 seminal things, and one is Muhammad Ali. His refusal to go to war in 1967 was the first anti-war protest by a significant Black figure, and it became transcendent, quite frankly. It was horrible for him in his career. He couldn't fight for 4 years, and ironically came back to Atlanta to fight the first time 4 years later in 1970. I actually tell you, it's all these intersections. Muhammad Ali, because he couldn't fight, he went on a college speaking tour, and he came to Shaw University, again, Shaw University, Black colleges. He came to Shaw University, and it was a gym packed with people. We heard him speak, and it was just one of the incredible experiences to hear him, and then later to actually spend time with him when he lit the torch in 1996 at the Olympic Games. It's sort of all connected. And then, as you heard earlier, when Dr. Rice talked about Tommy Smith and John Carlos, one is in 67 with Ali refusing to go to war. And by the way, really the first person to start talking about Black pride and Black beauty and all those kind of things. Ali was really a transcendent figure. And then in 68 at the Olympic Games, where because they had banned Ali, a number of athletes began talking about, Black athletes have been protesting not going to the Olympic Games. And a number of them did not go, by the way. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, one of the great basketball players of all time, refused to go to the Olympic Games because of what they had done with Ali. And but Carlos and Tommy Smith went. They're raising the fist is still one of the iconic Olympic and historical pictures of all time. And it really represented this protest that I think really embodied the Black Power movement and gave so many people a sense of pride. But it was a very tumultuous time. They now live in Atlanta, and I've had an occasion to spend time with both of them. So all this sort of comes together to simply say that sports and politics and the Olympic pride is all really wrapped up into one sort of great conundrum, where you see Colin Kaepernick, who continues the same protest of Tommy Smith and Carlos, and of course Muhammad Ali. And I think you have to also say what the WNBA players are doing and what the NBA players have done. I think it's just, it really represents a great sense of pride for all of us, and we ought to be supportive, because a lot of America is not supportive, and these athletes risk they have only a short time window for their entire career. So I think we have to be really much more supportive than we would imagine, because it's a very difficult endeavor, putting one's career on the line for a cause.
It is indeed. Mayor Campbell said that sports and politics are all wrapped up into one. You guys are athletes, Mr. Spikes and Mrs. Evans. Do you feel that pressure to be not only a role model, but an activist? And is that inherent, the politics of protest, the politics of resistance, the politics of representation? Is that inherent in your being as an athlete? And do you accept that? Dr. Rice talked about self, relation, and collective. Is that how you process your presence as athletes?
For me, when I went into the sport of bobsled, it was more from an athlete perspective. I was already a successful track and field athlete, and at that point in my life, I was working as a sports performance trainer, personal trainer, and I'm helping all these other people, but it was something missing for myself and my goals, and that's when bobsled popped into the picture. But that was 2012, and I had 2 years before my first Olympic Games. And in that process, I was still in this mode to where I'm going in it to win it. I'm going into a new sport with the goal to win an Olympic gold medal. But as I started to progress through the sport and through the season and get closer to the Olympics, I was receiving so many messages and feedback from people, women from my city, from the city of Chicago, where I'm from, people from around the world. And it wasn't just in support of me pushing a sled down an ice track. It was the things that I was fighting against and overcoming in order to get to that point. Like, I'm a Black girl in a predominantly white and European sport. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. Nothing about that is something you would tell somebody from the South Side of Chicago they could go be an Olympic Olympic bobsledder. And so for me, at first, I was going into it with this mentality just to be like in it to win it. But as I started to understand that my platform stood for so much more, it gave me a new sense of pride. Like, I wore my uniform and I represented everything as best as I could, because I felt like I was standing for a little more than just myself, and it was more than just the medal. I had people rooting for me that I had never met and telling me that they had their kids watch to see that it's possible to go to these places and to do these things, or it motivated this woman to go after a position in her job. And so realizing that no matter how hard it got, I had people rooting for me and in my corner that I didn't even know personally, it definitely made me wear my pride a little different. And so when I was up there competing in 2014 and I ultimately won bronze, it wasn't just for myself. It felt like it was for my city of Chicago, Black people. I was representing my country in a way that stood for so much more.
Mr. Spikes?
Yeah, I share some of the same sentiments that Asia shared. And I go all the way back to the beginning. When I first walked into the locker room in the NFL, as an athlete, you become tunnel vision. And the tunnel vision comes from, I need to make sure that I do everything I possibly can do to make sure that I continue to have this platform in order to have an opportunity to influence. And I think, and I go back and it was a great question, because it made me think about something that I never really shared with a lot of people. In the year 2000 in Cincinnati, Ohio, they built a national Black History Museum. And they were looking for funding, and they came to the Cincinnati Bengals. And they knew I did a lot of work in the community, but somebody approached me about being the figure to be able to go out, not only talk to my teammates, but go out in the community and just share some of my thoughts on why. And I was so naive at the time. I was only 23 years old, 22, 23. And so when I showed up, I remember going speaking at schools. I remember going speaking at major corporations. And I mean, it was almost like I was the CEO. And that was the first thing that really like brought the awareness to me that, listen, you are doing something way bigger than just going out playing football. You have the ability to not only increase awareness across the board when it comes to different demographics, but you also have an opportunity to lead by example. And so that's exactly what I did. And so I started taking the knowledge from me seeing, going to some of the meetings and getting some of the feedback of kids talking to me at school. How can they be like me? And eventually that part led to me becoming Walter Payton Man of the Year when I played with the San Francisco 49ers. And so, you know, when you bring that question about, absolutely. The more and more now that we go through and we see athletes, you talk about Colin Kaepernick. I love what he did. May not agree with everything that he did, but I love what he did to just bring a spotlight to the attention to make everybody slow down and say, what is his why? And I think now you're seeing more of an increased awareness across the board with athletes, understanding that, hey, even though you've been blessed with the athletic ability to go out and provide from a financial aspect, but it's much bigger than what that paycheck you can ever receive.
Dr. Bailey? Your perspective is not from the athletic perspective, but your perspective is from an everyday perspective, and these images that we see of athletes protesting and these using their activism. What does that mean for those of us who we don't have an NFL platform, or we don't have an Olympic platform? We have the platform in our house or the platform in our neighborhood, or we're a parent like Bill Campbell's mother, like everyday people.
Sure, and I'll say it's really wonderful to be a part of this conversation as somebody who grew up a little bit scared of sports, because I was always in the library, still a nerd, definitely identify with that as part of who I am. But sports are such a huge part of our life in America, and to deny Black people's place in sports and the political power of Black people in sports, I think is such a problem, something that I think everyday people can really see. You know, making Colin Kaepernick a household name has everything to do with the power and the platform of sports to bring a political conversation to the fore that people aren't having. And I think about that not just in terms of Colin Kaepernick, but other people who have been such important communicators and uniters. I mean, even things that are weird, like Dennis Rodman and his, connection to North Korea, like that is somewhat absurd in some way, but to me, it really signals the power of sports and its place within our idea of who we are as Americans, and Black people's specific legacy in that narrative. And so often, as we've seen, I mean, just listening to Asia's story, I mean, to be, a Black woman in a sport that has traditionally, for all of this time, been led by, white European folks. I mean, just to come in new and already get a medal, I think is just so amazing and so impressive, and a real testament to how Black people, show up. Because when we show up, we have to show up, at 110%. Like, otherwise we don't even get there. So I do think that there is a real power there for everyone who gets to see Black people in public space and the spaces that we choose not to go to. So one of the things that has also been instrumental for me as a layperson is the way that some sports icons are choosing not to go to the White House, choosing not to interact in certain public spaces because they're trying to make sure that people know that they don't want to be associated with this current administration, or that they are going to take a knee, do something that is going to disrupt people's expectations of Black athletes just going along to get along. And even in that, you know, Black athletes make up such a small percentage of athletics anyway, but they have such an enormous impact on the way we think about sports in terms of their visibility. So I think that that platform has such potential and power that we should really tap into it more.
Wonderful. Brandon, you have that question ready? Our young Morehouse student?
Yes, ma'am. And I want to thank everybody for coming on. I'm a Morehouse senior. Currently, I'm from Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I just want to thank you guys for taking you guys' time out. As we talk about community in relationship to the subjugation of Black bodies, I wanted to think about Black athletes within the Black community in ways that we can kind of like transmute some of these imaginings of our bodies and begin to reestablish sports and entertainment industries around empowering our communities economically and socially, kind of rather than remain in the status quo. Can you all speak to the power of athletes such as Makira Maker? Dr. Rice kind of touched on that, who was a 5-star athlete who chose to attend Howard University instead of receiving an offer from one of the blue blood programs such as UCLA or Kentucky, and the potential impact of an activist decision such as these to not only take control of our bodies, but also to funnel more resources and connections into our communities.
I'd like to hear.
I was just going to say, I was really excited for the question because it immediately made me think of Monet Davis and her decision to go to Howard University. Or did she go Howard or Hampton? I think she went to Hampton, exactly. So I just think it's so wonderful to see like a young athlete making the decision to go to an HBCU. And for me, that's also a question for HBCUs to make sure that they are not getting rid of the athletic programs that would actually attract someone like a Monet Davis to their campus. Unfortunately, I'm a Spelman grad, and we got rid of our athletic programs, I think 2 years ago. And the decision, you know, I think was a hard one for the school to make, but ultimately they decided that there wasn't money in, you know, supporting athletics in that way. But I do think that as we see, Black athletes have such a disproportionate impact on our society and community that I really do think it's important for HBCUs in particular to do that work to highlight and support our young people who are athletes, and that those scholarships really do make a difference in how people are able to support and pay for an education.
Mayor Campbell, can you jump in and talk a little bit about the importance of the economics part of Brandon's question and being able to understand how you use your Black body, not only for sport, but for the community and the economic development and resources for your community and HBCUs in particular?
I was brought up in politics. I was handing out political flyers when I was 5 years old. My father would leave me and my brother and sister at a precinct when we were 5 to hand out stuff all day when there were elections. And if I have heard one thing in my entire life, not just from athletes, from every walk of life, it is, I hate politics. It is inevitable that you will run into somebody who will say, I hate politics. And I always say, well, how about the air you breathe? How about the food that you eat? How about the schools that your kids attend? How about the policing in your community? And so this notion that athletes should stay in their lane, You know, there was the Fox News, which I never watch, by the way. I would never, ever turn on Fox News. Never will, never have, because it's just a racist dog whistle continuously. I hear Black people all the time say, well, I watch it because I want to hear what they're saying. I know what they're saying. I already know what, I mean, who needs to know more about what they're saying? But, you know, they had this fun, I guess this Laura Ingraham, who said to shut up and dribble. I guess to one of the great basketball players who is so much a part of the political movements. And so what I would say is, it's not just about sports. Sports is just another element of life, but politics is where everything is decided. And even politics decides about sports. You're even seeing now, as an example with the pandemic, where the different conferences are deciding whether or not even to play sports. So it's all politics. And so what I would say is, for those athletes in the past who have taken stands, progressive stands, and remember, Colin Kaepernick is in a long line of distinguished athletes who have sacrificed their careers and who have made great sacrifices. Tommy Smith and John Carlos couldn't run for a long time. I mean, my goodness, they were thrown out of the Olympic Games. And so what I would simply say to Brandon, as a senior, I don't know whether you're going back to Colorado or you're going to stay here in Atlanta. Obviously, Atlanta's a better spot for you. But what I would say is that whatever your field, whether it's sports, whether you're a distinguished filmmaker like Deborah, or you're a writer like Miss Bailey, or whatever your field, politics is where decisions are made about the future of our community. And there are many athletes, by the way, who have taken their the economic development in a very significant way. And not only so as a platform for political involvement, but they've also taken the opportunity for using their platform for economic development. My son just gave me a book on LeBron James called the first $1 billion athlete. And it's all about him. He has now got a $100 million deal from Netflix. He's doing a bunch of other things with not only films, but economic development. And so what I would say is, when you're an athlete, or you're a student, or you're a writer, or you're a professor or a filmmaker, the real challenge is not just to stay in your lane. It is to use your lane to change community and make it better and broaden the entire impact. Because if you're an athlete and you have that moment of as a platform and all the spotlight shines on you, that's the opportunity for you to do good things. You know, John Lewis, of course, talked about good trouble. It's the time for you to get into good trouble and make positive things happen for your community, whether it's economic development, whether it's registering people to vote, whether it's making certain that the response for the pandemic, where people wearing masks. I mean, my goodness, every single thing where you have the opportunity to make life better for your community, you ought to do that, because you're standing on the shoulders of so many people who sacrificed to get you there. I mean, you're talking about a couple of athletes who are now going to HBCUs. My goodness, so many Black athletes could not play at a major institution for so long. I mean, I saw Earl Monroe throw in 50 points when he's playing at Winston-Salem State back in the 60s. The great athletes couldn't play at UCLA or Michigan or Alabama. And now they're all playing there, which is fine. But I'm simply saying, use your platform for good. And that's the real message of this seminar. It's the message of Deborah's film. It's the message of Brother Spikes' platform about what he's doing now. Everything that we're doing has to have a motivation for how we can uplift and make things better, because otherwise, what's the point of being here?
What is the point of being here? Brandon, does that answer your question? And it makes me think of a question. TKO, the NFL is not going to fly that Black Lives Matter flag. They're not going to do it. So as a former NFL player, you're going to go to the NFL Hall of Fame. What position does that put activism in for current and future stars of the NFL when your organization says we're not going to fly the Black Lives Matter flag? And Janice Yates in the Q&A lobs on top of that. Is this now more of a glorified slave trade then? Are we controlling the bodies of these Black athletes in the public eye when we don't align with their philosophies or if we don't align with their activism? And that's for you as well, Asia, because the Olympic body is notorious for controlling every aspect of the Olympics. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. No Black Lives Matter flag in the NFL for the entire season, although there's not really going to be a season, but talk to me a little bit about that.
I think it's disappointing, and I'll speak to you from the shoes of a current player, even though I don't play anymore. It's plenty of issues or conversations that we have inside of those rooms that are disappointing. And when we look at the month of October, it's Breast Awareness Month, Susan B. Komen. And you look around November sometime, I think they have a big push for Salvation Army. And they want players to go out and you make your PSAs. We want you to do a little snippet on the Jumbotron to get everybody, make everybody aware. But when it comes back to what we're doing, or when it comes back to supporting us, which we are the majority in the game, 70+%, now it's a little reservation, and now it's a little hesitation. And so do I personally think it's disrespectful? I do. I do know that I've heard rumors that they are working on some other things to show their support for the Black Lives Matters outside of flying the planes, but that yet remains to be seen. But I think overall it's disrespectful, and a lot of guys inside of the locker room, and this is where I'm so happy about it, because you having more guys having a conversation about it. And owners now know some of the stuff that they used to pull, even back when I was playing, without even something as simple as, you know what, versus us making the decision about our community, why not, let's bring in some of the guys who we know that are deeply embedded into our community, and let's get their take. And so one of the things that I'm proud of is to see guys on these teams, even in training camp to this point. I talk to several guys all the time, just on a weekly check-in. And I was surprised to hear that they're having these conversations as far as what does this look like when we get out of training camp, and how can we give back grassroots? Because at the end of the day, I think it's quite dumb, to be honest with you, if you're not giving back to the game that's bringing you money. And you understand, as the majority of players, 70% are Black, people of color. And so why not go back and invest into the infrastructure of the system of where all of these guys come from, all of these communities, if you want to say, hey, it's business first. But I do think it's kind of disrespectful when it comes to that. But from some of the conversations I had, I do see it's kind of, they're developing something that's supposed to be seen on a bigger platform if the season even starts.
Aisha?
Yeah, I think going into the 2014 Olympics, that was my first time doing these media tours. So they'll take you, we're housed in like Salt Lake City, Utah, do a bunch of press runs. You're basically on the stage, and they come through media asking you questions and everything. And so during that time, a lot of questions I received was regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, and if I was going to do things in support of it, like black out the flag on my uniform, kneel when I get on the podium, and make all these things. And it's hard sometimes understanding how to respond in the moment, because it's not that type of game. Every sport is very different. And if I were to do any of those things, I wouldn't compete. You wouldn't see me at all. I would get taken off or disqualified for having extra markings on my uniform, anything outside of the regulations for the Olympic Games, anything like that. And so it makes it tough to answer that and then feel like you're staying true to yourself. And so what I had to learn was balance and understand who I am and the platform I've been given, and learn how to intersect the two. I figured out how to be more involved in my community, and I didn't always have to just post it on Instagram or do a press release about it. It was just things I was doing on the regular, going back and talking to kids, showing them my medal, showing them places I've been, and just exposing them to the opportunities. I think for me, it made me understand how to have an impact in the world, in the areas and the communities that matter to me, in a way that was authentic to who I am. And it's tough, like with this platform comes that light, and people want to know what you think. They want to know if you're going to do something, and you're not always able to. And it's just about finding how to use your voice in your lane and create that impact that's very authentic to you. And I appreciate when I met David, it was at a leadership and sports advocacy event at Morehouse. And so it was mainly about understanding how to stand up for things we believe in and using our platform and our voice in a way that's authentic to who we are, but impacting more people. And so I really appreciate that. And through my journey as an Olympian, I learned how to use my platform to say how I feel, and to speak up for those who don't have that access, but to also be in a position to where I can have that platform and where I can speak for those who don't have that access.
There are a couple more questions and we're almost done. You guys hang in there with me that are on this Zoom. I want to get Izetta Autumn Mobley's question. She says, what about the Black body when there's a disability? There's hyperability and there's disability. How do we regard the Black body when there's disability? Dr. Bailey, talk to me a little bit about the Black body in the public eye when it's not perfect. Talk to me about the Black body in the public eye when it is not the expected prescription of the Black body in the public eye.
Sure, and just to say a shout out to Dr. Izetta Autumn Mobley for that question. I do think that part of what we're talking about here is thinking through, when do Black bodies get to be on display? And part of that is we like to see Black bodies when they are in peak physical condition. So we're talking about all of this athleticism, we're talking about Black entertainers. Those are places where we get to see the Black body, but we don't often get to see Black disability publicly. And also, as Dr. Mobley's work and my work really looks at, for Black people, identifying as disabled is also something that we struggle with as Black people. You know, it doesn't necessarily line up with how we understand ourselves. I think about people in my family often who have disabilities, but might say they're on disability, but don't identify as disabled. So there's, again, this sense of disability as something that is perhaps something that you're dealing with, negotiating, but it doesn't always manifest as an identity, as something that people want to embrace. But I do start to think about disability and something, and even injury that happens to Black athletes, particularly when I'm thinking about the NFL and CTE and some of these injuries that happen. We want Black people to be a part of sports, but we also want us to survive, and we want to survive long enough to enjoy the benefits that these few places of access that we've been granted in American culture provide for us. So I think there's really another layer to this, which asks us to think about, you know, systemic racism and why it is that Black athletes can't get the protection that they need in the sports that they play. What happens to people who are disabled because they are participating in sport? And I'm thinking too about what this sets up for our young people. There was a question here, you know, about how are we thinking about bringing young people up within a sports community? And for me, one of the things I love most about sports is the collaborative work of the team, learning how to win, learning how to lose gracefully. But there's so much attached to sports for Black youth, in the sense that this might be your ticket out of, you know, wherever you're from. And I think that really sets up these unrealistic expectations, especially of the body, that can lead to, you know, youth injury, youth disablement that we haven't talked about nearly enough.
That is an absolutely eye-opening and fascinating answer. And it dovetails into something that I want, before our last question, for you to just jump into the idea of sexuality, gender, and how the media looks at if you are disabled or if you're a female, Black female athlete in particular. How do we show up both in science and in medicine? How are we treated? And then how are we written about?
Well, I think this, we mentioned Serena Williams early on. I mean, Serena Williams is somebody, if anybody knows about their body, it should be Serena Williams. And we know that when she was pregnant with Olympia and giving birth, that doctors didn't believe her when she talked about these symptoms that she was having that let her know that she had a clot. And so for me, Black women, when they interact with medicine, are often not seen as authorities on their own bodies. And even somebody who should be an authority on their body, more so than anyone else, an athlete whose whole bread and butter is built on their deep understanding and connection to their physical prowess, for it to be denied by doctors, it really threatened her life. And so we need to start letting Black athletes, Black people be seen as fully human, and not let the medical apparatus take away our sense of knowledge about ourselves. And I think there's, again, something that needs to happen in the way that sports are governed, so that the athletes have more control and can actually say for themselves, you know, it's great that they've figured out something where maybe we can, play basketball in Disney World, maybe. But my question then is, you know, what of the athletes who actually think that that's a risk? And this was a question with one of the athletes in the WNBA, right? You know, do I play where I have this risk that my Lyme disease could actually be activated by coronavirus and take this, you know, autoimmune risk to my system? Or do I, you know, sit this one out? So for me, I do think that we need to give athletes more control in that sense, and also to lower the stakes of sport in that way, so that people aren't feeling compelled to play to the point of complete and utter physical exhaustion.
Thank you so much. Last question for the entire panel. What advice would you give to the next generation of Black bodies that will be in the public eye? And what advice would you give to all of us because every single day, everyone on this Zoom, their Black body, their white body, whatever their background body is in the public eye? And how do you reconcile that pressure? How do you use that pressure to be a point of resistance and to represent, as Dr. Rice would say, both yourself, the relationship that you have, whether or not it's on a team, or the collectiveness of being Black? And so that's for closing question for all four of you. So jump in very quickly and then we'll wrap up. The Black body in the public eye. What's the advice and what does it really mean?
Well, only because I'm first on the little Zoom thing. Let me say that I think if we're really looking at the ultimate answer to that, it's the life of John Lewis. And the reason I say that is because John Lewis came from abject poverty in rural Alabama, the son of sharecroppers, and was denied a library card, really could not participate in any form of education whatsoever. He actually ended up writing to Dr. King because he was denied admission to Troy State. And here's a person who used the skills that were available, his body, his mind, and willing to sacrifice it in order to make things better for all of us. And then without virtually any predisposition for it, became one of the most beloved and powerful people in the history of our country. And as I talked about earlier, Deborah, at his funeral, I mean, here's when I met John Lewis, it was like meeting this historical figure. You know, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, those people wrote the Declaration of Independence, but here was someone who made America live up to the noble words that were written on the document. So it matters not whether you're an athlete or a writer or a scholar, you can always bend history if you're willing to get involved.
Bend history. I love that.
I would say the advice that I would leave and give to anybody, especially if they look like me, awareness is the beginning of change. It's not possible for you to change anything if you're not aware of it. I was told at the age of 8 years old by my father and my mother, be careful about what you do and make sure you keep a snot rag in your pocket at all times. That really meant you always keep your nose clean. And they went on to expand with that just to let me know that, Takeo, your name will go a lot further than you will ever go. And I didn't realize that, or I didn't understand that until I was drafted. And to go to certain places and you hear people say things about you, the way that you made them feel, it's two things that you can do to people when you have interactions to make them never forget you. People remember how you make them feel, and people remember what you say to them. And so my message to everybody who's listening is always understand that awareness is the beginning of change, but then also embrace the fact that you are in a position to be able to create change, regardless if you are a professional athlete or whether or not if you're doing it in the classroom. Because every day when you walk out is an opportunity to show not only who you are, but to leave an astounding effect on people who are looking at you to influence them. And at the end of the day, I realized that it's all about leveraging what you have in order to get what you want. And if you don't do it, somebody is going to do it to you. And I'm not saying it from a bad perspective, but it goes back to the political side that Dr. Campbell, Bill Campbell, Mayor Campbell was talking about. So you have to understand, in order to get something, in order to make a decision, you have to have a seat at the table. And if you don't have a seat at the table, I was always told you on the menu when you're about to be ate.
Yeah, and some advice I would love to add to that is staying true to who you are and what you feel in your heart. I think as we continue to grow and with all of the exposure and everything going on, it's easily to be persuaded or dissuaded for what you feel. And everyone will not always get your vision. Everyone will not always see it before it comes to fruition. And a lot of times you have to show people before they understand. And so in pursuing a path or putting yourself in that public eye, you just have to stay strong for yourself and remember that you were brought to this point and to this vision because it's possible. And having that faith and knowing that you'll be okay regardless is really key. And it's important to just to stay connected to that and to keep pushing forward. I think for me, I had to remember who I was and how I got to those points because just being in the room wasn't just good enough. I never had a goal to just be an Olympian. I never had a goal to just win an Olympic medal. When I decided to go to the 2014 Winter Olympic Games, it was to win an Olympic gold medal. And it was in a sport I had no background in. I knew nothing about outside of Cool Runnings. And so like for me to have gone and to push through, you grow with it. And I started to realize the value I brought as I started getting in more rooms. And so as I'm elevating and growing, I'm realizing the leverage and the platform I have, and I'm wearing it well. I'm not letting it discourage me. A lot of times it can be intimidating. Just being this Black woman in these rooms or in this platform or in this country to where everyone's looking at you crazy. No one looks like you. No one's even your height. So like a lot of times you're going to stand out regardless, and staying true to yourself and to your calling and what's in your heart will always lead you in the right way.
Thank you. Last words, Dr. Bailey.
I am just so grateful to have been part of this collective conversation. And for me, that reminds me to remind all of you, like, who are your people? Who are you bringing with you? Who supports you? And who gets your vision? Because it's not something that we do by ourselves. And the fact that, you know, Dr. Mobley was on the call asking a question, to me is an example of that. Who are the people who help push your thinking? Who are the people who are on your team? A little sports reference there. But like, who really has your back? And for that, I really think it's gonna take more than just the people who are immediately in your circle, and it might be people who surprise you. So being open to who that might be.
Absolutely, thank you. And for me, I want to thank Dr. Young. She's coming back on. I want to thank Lacey Barnes and Latricia Brown, who are on the Coffee Bluff Pictures team. They're great teammates, and I'm a huge sports fan. I was so proud that Dr. Thomas had that FSU picture in there, because I'm FSU all day long, and Janice Yates, who is on this panel also, attended FSU with me. And so being able to use,
Yeah, I don't.
is really, really, really important. So Dr. Young, thank you. It's been a great 3 weeks, a great mini course, a great opportunity to talk about Black body in the public eye with some of the smartest, most dynamic, most interesting people. Great professors, great scholars, great politicians, great athletes, great artists. A friend of mine, Dr. Jennifer Galvin, who did not attend an HBCU, but is steeped in the understanding of cross-cultural education and communication, said what was most valuable to her was to actually see the interdisciplinary approach to the discussion of this topic. And that stood out to her as being very valuable. As someone who's a public scientist turned filmmaker, that really helped her really crystallize that. And my great friend and my producer, John Norris, has been on these calls as well. And he's been listening, and it's helped him as a filmmaker and a producer. So thank you, Morehouse College. Thank you, great panelists. And I turn it over to you, Dr. Young.
Yep, I just want to say that was an amazing roundtable discussion. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to be with us, and we really do appreciate it. The session will be recorded, and once again, I want to just say a very huge thank you to the faculty, to the roundtable guests, to my partners with Coffee Bluff Pictures. There was a lot going on behind the scenes to make this happen, and it was just really wonderful. And I just want to end with this. Speaking about tables and who's having a seat at the table, it was Shirley Chisholm who said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a chair. Right. So I say, bring a folding chair or make your own table, right? Make your own table and bring your own spices, because we do it in a way that's very different. And for those who are unfamiliar with Morehouse, when the world opens back up again, we invite all of you to come down. A couple of folks have asked if we're going to do another course like this. This January, we're going to do a race science course that focuses on race science. We'll be talking about sports, medicine, policing. So please stay tuned for that. And a grateful thank you to everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the evening, and please stay safe. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.